Hello, I'm Nigel Crawhall and I'm Chief of Section for the Local and Indigenous Knowledge Systems program at UNESCO. And we are very pleased to work with the CABES team to present this course on an introduction to Indigenous and local knowledge of environmental biodiversity ecosystems issues in the Africa region. And this is our second course that we're offering, and we put together a series of videos to help you explore and understand some of the key themes. In my opening presentation, I'll be talking about some of the basic concepts of what is distinctive about Indigenous and local knowledge systems and how that may be helpful in your line of work, but also in trying to create a multi-evidence-based approach to decision-making around the environment and around livelihoods in the African context. So we've got a series of slides that we'll be sharing with you, and I'll talk through that theme following some of those main points. So I think the first thing to say is that Indigenous knowledge is many things. It's complex. It's held by many different people in many different languages. And for the most part, oral knowledge, Indigenous and local knowledge, is held orally rather than in a written format. So in the sort of tradition of Europe and other parts of the world, China, India, often knowledge was recorded and put down in writing in different formats, even from the time of ancient Egypt. But for most of the planet, knowledge is gained through practice and is transmitted through oral means from one generation to another, usually in the course of doing daily life, so of hunting, of pastoralism, of farming, but also finding important natural resources that people need to use, for example, wild honey or traditional medicines. So where do we start off with? What are the characteristics of Indigenous and local knowledge that make it so particular and special, and in some ways sometimes different from science and sometimes very similar to science and overlapping in some of the ways in which observation is done? So the first place to start is the idea that Indigenous knowledge is place-based and it's contextual. So Indigenous knowledge emerges from a particular relationship between humans and the environment that they're living in. And that gets expressed through their language and through their concepts and how they relate to each other and how they relate to species and the landscape. So Indigenous knowledge is very specific to a location, even though that knowledge may cover a wide area and it may be shared by different communities over large territory, for example. But on the other hand, it is also specific to the types of ways in which people live on the land. So their modality of life, their way of subsistence, so whether they're hunter-gatherers or whether they're pastoralists or farmers or some mix of the above, this will shape how the knowledge is produced, the resources are used, and the sustainability is achieved within the landscape. The other feature is that knowledge is held by the whole of society. So it has characteristic of being produced by the whole of society and transmitted across generations. Within that, there's also a distribution of knowledge. So in some societies, men have certain functions and women have certain functions. Elders have certain functions and youth have certain functions. So people have different types of responsibility in relation to the natural resources and in relation to sustaining the society as a whole. In some places in Africa, it's very common that groups of people are organized according to age sets. So it's very common in pastoralist groups to have a whole grade of young men, but also can be of young women, who go through life going through these cycles of responsibility within their community, and at each level taking certain sets of decisions and producing or processing certain types of knowledge. The other characteristic is that Indigenous knowledge is typically systems thinking. So whereas there may be a lot of detail in Indigenous knowledge, so very precise taxonomies around tree types, leaf formation, types of grasses, types of rainfall, types of ways in which water rests on the land, types of birds, types of atmospheric conditions. There may be a lot of precision in the taxonomy, but at the same time, this precision is systemic. So looking at how society and nature interact with each other, how atmosphere and nature interact with each other, and trying to understand the correlations between the different parts of the system. And that's quite different from the way that Western science, or science in the sort of formal sense, is put together, where you often have separation of different disciplines. So in science, we typically think of physics and meteorology, oceanography, or biology as being different subjects. Whereas in the Indigenous system, each element is woven into a systemic way of thinking and understanding correlations between those different characteristics. So it's another sort of defining feature. And how knowledge gets transmitted. So if knowledge is entirely oral, it also requires quite a complex intellectual superstructure to be able to carry information. So for example, in some of the research in Southern Africa, it's been indicated that communities can memorize and transmit across generations substantial events that they experience. So if there's a big variation in the weather pattern, for example, very high rainfall or prolonged drought that may go on for any number of seasons or years, that becomes coded in the knowledge system in case this issue comes up again. You can think of some other examples in other parts of the world, like where the communities have memory of tsunamis. So during the terrible tsunami that hit Southeast Asia a number of years ago, we noted that there were some communities, particularly in northern Sumatra and in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, where the communities easily recognized the nature of the tsunami wave and took appropriate action in that context. But the majority of people did not have that knowledge. They had never transmitted orally those insights or that awareness. So some of our characteristics about Indigenous knowledge is that it's place-based, it's collective but distributed in very specific ways, it's systems thinking with elements being related to each other, it comes through Indigenous languages, it's orally transmitted, and that transmission has to go into a social system that can make sense of it and retransmit it across sometimes many generations. And I'll come to some other characteristics as well. Specifically in our African context, one of the important issues to understand is the relationship between sustainability within an environmental niche and how humans construct their social organization and their economic organization. So over the last 20, 30 years, there's been a lot of research in linguistics showing that languages are, in complex ways, correlated with biodiversity. So the higher the biodiversity, the more likely that you're going to have multiple languages using a different niche. Whereas low biodiversity, you're going to normally have languages that spread over large areas. So in an African context, you can look at the situation of the Sahara Desert and the desert regions of North Africa, where you have a language like Tamazight and its associated language Tamashek, covering thousands of kilometers and being transmitted by nomadic communities across that space, so that people have very high level of comprehension over a vast territory. But when you go into the equatorial rainforest or into the Kalahari Desert, where there's quite a lot of specificity to the biodiversity, there you tend to have many languages in that territory, and not necessarily a high level of mutual intelligibility across them, because people are functioning in niche areas of the environment. There's quite a lot to think about what that means, but it means when we're looking at knowledge and biodiversity, language is a clue to how the coding and complexity has happened. But also in the African context, it's important for us to distinguish between how people have developed sustainable economic systems and subsistence systems. So the difference between hunter-gatherers and how they organize themselves, pastoralists and farmers, and sometimes there's quite a complex mix of these elements, and usually there are relational there's neighborly relations between these communities that also help shape knowledge, move resources between different language groups and ethnic groups and different systems of subsistence. So trying to understand how, for example, concepts of famine or food sustainability may be very different for hunter-gatherers than it is for farmers, for example, and the types of information that they focus on. But also, in most of the systems we're talking about, there's a long-term governance mechanism that underlies the whole system. So fundamentally, all humans who rely on natural resources organize them themselves in a certain way to make sure that that resource is sustained within the territory they live in. And that only gets disrupted if there's an external influence that forces, it could be a natural influence, it could be a human influence that destabilizes these resources. And this is documented in a lot of detail through the work of Eleanor Ostrom, for example, and the researchers who worked in that school. And lastly, knowledge comes from doing. So the people who are the strongest knowledge holders are not the ones that you can necessarily easily recognize in a community. They're often the ones who are the ones who do things. So women who spend a lot of time in the bush have very developed types of indigenous knowledge about the environment, and likewise pastoralists or nomads who are moving over large territories, who may be less accessible when you want to have dialogue around knowledge systems. So those are some of the characteristics that are worth looking at. And the other part where I want to finish up on for this opening session is around knowledge that can be shared and knowledge that should not be shared. So in most African societies, there are relations with the natural world that have a sacred quality to them or a taboo quality to them, or are restricted in terms of access. So there are places, for example, in the forest where certain men's rituals or women's rituals happen, and the opposite sex shouldn't go there. And people who are not ritually qualified should not go into that territory. It's considered dangerous for them, unwise. They're not permitted to do that. Communications, for example, in the Central African region, the Congo Basin, the ability of indigenous peoples to speak to the forest and have the forest speak back to them, that's something that is metaphysical. It's something that they understand, but is not accessible for other people, and sometimes should not be observed or accessed by outsiders who don't have that ritual position. So I brought into this conversation a word that I learned when I was working in the Southern Kalahari Desert. And this was taught to me by a grandmother called Kona Roy, who's now passed on from the Khai community, about this concept of Khai. And in their culture, Khai refers to the life force that infuses all living things, all plants, all animals, all birds, anything that's alive. But when it rains, it can also infuse the earth. So they have a conceptualization that the underlying form of energy in life is shared between the living and the dead, and between the visible and the invisible, between the earth and the living creatures, and that humans find themselves in a custodial role, and they have a responsibility to sustain the system. So those things are outside of science. This is something science doesn't necessarily understand, cannot measure, or cannot even necessarily explain. But for the people, it's very important. And that's why we look for promoting, and we'll explore in this course, an ethics approach where there's respect for these different types of knowledge, because it's in their totality that they've been able to transmit these over many generations. So we hope you enjoy the course. We hope you find some of this useful, and there'll be opportunities to interact during the course and to share your stories and to also feedback about what we're doing. So we hope you enjoy it. Thank you.